I got the promotion I worked so hard for, but when I started getting blamed for my boss's mistakes, I realized I was just a scapegoat in their corporate game. Now I'm struggling to decide if I should quit or stay. I remember the exact moment I found out I got the promotion. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by the usual hum of keyboards, the occasional ringing of phones, and the soft murmur of co-workers in the open-plan office. My inbox had pinged with a message from HR, marked confidential, and as I hesitated to click it, my heart was racing faster than I ever thought possible. It had been months, no, years, of late nights, missed weekends, and countless cups of coffee, all leading up to this. I had poured myself into every project, stayed after hours to help colleagues, and even taken on responsibilities that weren't technically mine, just to prove that I was ready. I had convinced myself that hard work, dedication, and loyalty were enough to secure the recognition I deserved. And then, finally, there it was, the official confirmation. I was promoted to senior project manager. For a brief moment, I felt invincible. The pride was intoxicating. My name had been announced in a small internal email, and a few co-workers came by to congratulate me, their smiles warm but slightly hesitant, as if they were measuring my worth against their own ambitions. I smiled and nodded, feeling the thrill of validation, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes all the exhaustion worthwhile. I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I had finally arrived. The first week in my new role was overwhelming but exhilarating. I had more authority, more responsibility, and an entire team depending on me. I drafted schedules, organized meetings, and started making strategic decisions that would shape our projects. My boss, who had been distant and occasionally dismissive before, seemed pleased, at least outwardly. He nodded approvingly when I presented plans, sometimes offering brief, cryptic remarks that left me guessing but eager to please. At first, it felt like a partnership. I assumed my boss's guidance was intended to help me grow into the role. I was careful, meticulous, and, most importantly, determined to make an impression. Then, about a month in, things started to shift. I noticed small inconsistencies in our project timelines, miscommunications with clients, and tasks being reassigned without explanation. At first, I tried to attribute these to normal corporate chaos. Everyone made mistakes, after all, and I was still learning the ropes. But the first real warning sign came during a team meeting when a client complained about a delayed project was brought up. My boss, with a tight smile, turned to me and asked why the issue hadn't been flagged sooner. I was stunned. I had been reporting progress weekly, providing updates in meetings, and even sending detailed summaries via email. I calmly explained the steps I had taken, emphasizing my documentation and prior notifications. My boss listened, nodded slowly, and then said, almost casually, "Well, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'm counting on you to handle it next time." There was no acknowledgement that the situation wasn't my fault, just a subtle implication that I was responsible. Over the following weeks, the pattern became painfully clear. Mistakes that weren't mine, some beyond my control, were quietly attributed to me. If a deadline was missed, I was the one asked for explanations. If a client expressed frustration, I was the one who had failed to manage expectations. Even minor administrative errors, like a spreadsheet miscalculation or a misfiled document, somehow ended up in my lap. Each time, I followed the procedure, submitted reports, and documented my work meticulously, but it never seemed to matter. My boss never corrected the narrative. In fact, sometimes I caught them subtly shifting blame, making offhand comments that implied incompetence on my part to anyone who would listen. I began to notice the toll it was taking on me. I started losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night replaying every conversation, every email, wondering if I had missed a detail, if I had somehow made a mistake that justified this treatment. I became anxious before meetings, constantly rehearsing answers, anticipating questions, and imagining worst-case scenarios. My coworkers, at first friendly, started to pull back slightly. Maybe it was the tension, or maybe they sensed the subtle way I was being undermined. Lunches became solitary affairs at my desk, and casual conversations felt strained. Then came the day I realized the depth of the problem. A major project had been delayed because my boss had approved changes to the client's request without notifying me. The client was furious, emails pouring in, demanding explanations. I immediately compiled a timeline, evidence, emails, and notes, intending to show my boss the chain of responsibility. When I approached them, hoping for acknowledgement, I was met with a defensive wall. "This is on you," they said sharply. "You should have caught it. I expect better performance in the future." I froze. I wanted to argue, to show proof, to make them see the truth, but their tone and the finality of their words left no room for discussion. I walked back to my desk in stunned silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. The reality hit me like a gut punch. I wasn't being promoted because of my talent or dedication. I was being set up as a scapegoat, a convenient target for any mistake, while my boss remained untouchable. The following days were a blur of frustration and disbelief. I found myself questioning everything. Had I been naive, blindly loyal? Was this what corporate life had always been, and I was only just seeing it? Every interaction with my boss became a minefield. I had to carefully phrase emails, anticipate hidden traps and instructions, and constantly double-check every piece of work. Even team members, who had once looked to me for guidance, seemed hesitant to fully trust my direction, perhaps sensing the precariousness of my position. It was as if I was navigating a complex game where the rules were intentionally vague, and I had no idea when I would be punished for following them. The mental exhaustion was compounded by physical strain. I developed headaches that no amount of coffee or over-the-counter painkillers could ease. My appetite dwindled. I found myself staring blankly at screens, unable to focus, and yet terrified of missing something crucial. I began journaling in secret, trying to organize my thoughts, listing incidents, and documenting unfair treatment. I even considered approaching HR, but the fear of retaliation loomed large. This wasn't a company that acknowledged wrongdoing at the top. It was a system built to protect those in power while quietly redirecting blame downward. And yet I stayed. Despite the mounting stress, the sense of betrayal, and the clear manipulation, I stayed. I rationalized it in countless ways. The promotion was hard-earned. Leaving would feel like failure, and besides, I still wanted to prove myself, to show that I was competent, that I wasn't just a convenient scapegoat. But each day, the internal conflict grew heavier. I started imagining scenarios where I quit, leaving behind the recognition, the salary increase, the title, but also scenarios where I stayed, endured, and somehow found a way to navigate the corporate maze without losing myself entirely. Then came the subtle but unmistakable isolation. My boss would call me into their office for updates, sessions that often lasted hours and ended with cryptic comments about performance. Other colleagues were encouraged to bypass me, going directly to my boss with issues, further undermining my authority. Emails that once required my input were suddenly addressed to my boss first, as if my role was a mere formality. I began to feel like a puppet, my strings pulled by someone who had no intention of letting me succeed unless it served their narrative. The promotion that once felt like a victory now felt like a carefully laid trap, one I had walked into willingly. The turning point came one evening when, after another round of unjust blame for a project delay, I found myself sitting alone in the office lawn after everyone had left. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the walls, and the empty space amplified the sound of my own breathing. I went over every detail again, every email, every instruction, every decision I had made. It was infuriatingly clear I had done nothing wrong, and yet I was being punished. The thought struck me like lightning. I was disposable. My boss, and perhaps the company itself, had no interest in fairness or acknowledgement of effort. I was a pawn in a much larger game, a convenient figure to absorb mistakes while the higher-ups remained untouchable. I left the office that night with a mix of rage and despair. The streets were quiet, the city lights flickering, but inside me, a storm raged. I thought about my career, my ambitions, the long nights, and sacrifices. I wondered if it was worth continuing in an environment where merit meant nothing, where my work was only as valuable as it was convenient for someone else. And yet, the idea of walking away felt equally terrifying. I had worked so hard, endured so much, and invested so deeply in proving myself. Could I really just throw it all away? Could I survive the uncertainty of starting over elsewhere, with no guarantee that the next job wouldn't be the same game played under a different name? I began noticing other subtle signs of manipulation too. Meetings where my suggestions were dismissed, but later repeated by my boss as their own. Praise for my work given publicly to others while I was subtly criticized in private. The more I observed, the more I realized that every interaction was calculated, designed to keep me in a constant state of self-doubt. I felt trapped, caught between my desire to succeed and the growing awareness that the path I had fought so hard to reach was not a place of achievement, but a carefully orchestrated pressure cooker designed to break me. By the time the first month had passed, I was exhausted in every sense of the word, mentally, emotionally, and physically. I could feel the walls closing in, the sense of entrapment tightening around me like a vice. Yet, at the same time, I clung to the faint hope that things might change. That if I could just endure, if I could just prove my competence, the recognition and fairness I had believed in might eventually follow. I clung to that hope like a lifeline, even as the evidence around me screamed that I was only a scapegoat, a tool in a corporate game far bigger than I had imagined. It was in those long, sleepless nights, replaying every interaction, that I realized I was at a crossroads. I could fight, endure, and hope for change, or I could walk away, abandoning the promotion, the salary increase, and the validation I had worked so hard for, but reclaiming my peace of mind. And yet, making that choice was terrifying because it wasn't just a decision about a job. It was a decision about who I was, about what I would allow myself to endure, about how I defined my worth. The days that followed felt like a slow, relentless unraveling. Each morning, I walked into the office with a sense of foreboding, a weight pressing against my chest that made every step feel heavier. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, but the subtle undercurrents of hostility had become almost impossible to ignore. My boss's behavior had shifted from passive oversight to something more insidious, more deliberate. Meetings that were once collaborative now felt like interrogations. Questions that seemed innocuous were loaded with implication, small verbal traps designed to catch me in a moment of uncertainty. I had to tread carefully, constantly calculating my words, anticipating reactions, and guarding against even the smallest mistake. It began with the projects. The ones I had painstakingly planned, delegating tasks, creating timelines, and ensuring all the moving parts were aligned, started to fall apart, not due to my actions, but due to last-minute changes my boss made without informing me. One particular incident still sticks vividly in my mind. We were working on a high-profile client proposal, the kind that could make or break our department's reputation. I had spent weeks coordinating the team, drafting sections, cross-referencing data, and preparing for a final presentation. The night before the deadline, my boss called me into their office, asking me to review a few adjustments they had made. I didn't notice the subtle but critical changes that contradicted the initial data I had verified. The next morning, when the client rejected the proposal outright, I was called into a private meeting. My boss's tone was cold and clipped. "I expected better from you," they said. "How did this happen?" I opened my mouth to explain, to show the documentation, the careful verification, the fact that the changes weren't mine. But before I could finish, they waved me off. "Just fix it. I don't want excuses. Make sure it doesn't happen again." It was in that moment that the gnawing realization deepened. I was no longer valued for my skill or dedication. I was valued for my ability to absorb blame, to protect my boss from scrutiny while the work I did was either appropriated or discredited. I left that meeting feeling hollow, my stomach twisting in knots, my head pounding from the tension. Back at my desk, I went over the emails and files again, confirming that I had done everything correctly. Yet, the dissonance between truth and perception was almost unbearable. I felt trapped in a system that rewarded deception and punished competence. Interactions with colleagues became increasingly complicated. Some were sympathetic, quietly offering words of encouragement in passing, but most seemed to avoid any involvement that might implicate them. I noticed the subtle ways alliances were shifting. Emails were CC'd to multiple people unnecessarily. Conversations that used to be informal and friendly were now monitored, carefully worded. I began to sense an unspoken hierarchy of trust, a network my boss had meticulously crafted where only they could remain untouchable. Everyone else was expendable, and I had been marked. One afternoon, I received a message from a coworker I had considered a close ally. "Be careful," it read. "I've noticed how a boss, treats you. Don't get caught off guard. I stared at the message, the words feeling both like a lifeline and a confirmation of my worst fears. I was isolated, under constant surveillance, and every move I made was scrutinized for potential failure. The thought that my promotion had been nothing more than a setup to use me as a buffer for my boss's errors made my chest tighten. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every instruction, every decision. I documented emails, chat messages, and verbal conversations. I began carrying a small notebook with me to meetings, jotting down notes in real time, hoping that if the situation escalated, I would have something tangible to defend myself. The meticulousness, however, came at a cost. My brain felt constantly on edge, my energy drained by the effort of maintaining an armor of proof against an invisible and manipulative force. I barely slept. Nights were long, filled with mental rehearsals of conversations, imagining how I could defend myself if my boss blamed me again. I started waking up in cold sweats, heart racing, dreading the phone ringing or an unexpected meeting request. And yet, there were moments of irony that cut even deeper. My boss would occasionally offer faint praise, a compliment so carefully measured that it was almost insulting. "Good work on the presentation," they would say in passing, their eyes flicking away to a spreadsheet or another screen. The words sounded hollow, a token thrown to maintain the illusion of appreciation. And then, almost immediately, they would find some discrepancy, some minor oversight, often something I had no control over, and the cycle of blame would begin anew. Each day, I felt my confidence eroding, replaced by a gnawing anxiety, an almost physical tightness in my chest that never seemed to subside. The breaking point, however, came during a company-wide meeting that I had been asked to present at. I had spent hours preparing, ensuring that every figure was accurate, every slide polished, and every talking point rehearsed. As I began my presentation, I noticed my boss frowning, occasionally whispering to another manager in the room. Midway through, they interrupted me, pointing out an error that didn't exist, something that I had double-checked and verified multiple times. The room went silent. Eyes turned to me. I felt the heat rising in my face, a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and disbelief. I tried to explain calmly, presenting my evidence, but my boss cut me off, dismissing me with a wave of the hand. "We'll discuss this later," they said, and the meeting moved on as if nothing had happened. I retreated to my office afterward, shaking. The humiliation, the helplessness, and the clear manipulation hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my desk, at the neatly stacked papers, at the glowing screen, and felt a wave of despair. I had worked so hard to reach this level, to prove my worth, only to realize that none of it mattered in the grand scheme of my boss's games. I was not a valued employee. I was a tool, a shield, a convenient scapegoat to absorb criticism while they remained untouchable. The stress began to manifest in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started having constant headaches, jaw pain from clenching my teeth, and a persistent sense of fatigue that no amount of rest could alleviate. My appetite dwindled, replaced by a jittery, anxious energy that made it difficult to focus. Even simple tasks became mentally exhausting because every action carried the potential for blame. I found myself replaying scenarios endlessly, analyzing every word I had said, every email I had sent, searching for the smallest flaw that could be used against me. I reached a point where I began questioning my own judgment. Was I overreacting? Was I truly competent? Or was this pattern of blame somehow my fault? The doubt was insidious, creeping into every corner of my mind. Friends outside of work noticed the change, the tension in my posture, the nervousness in my speech, the way I would zone out mid-conversation. I tried to laugh it off, to insist I was fine, but inside, I felt as if I were unraveling, thread by thread. And then came the whispers. Small, almost imperceptible comments from coworkers, subtle jabs that hinted at the chaos surrounding me. "I guess some people just can't handle responsibility," one would mutter. "Better watch your back," said another. I realized that my boss had effectively turned the entire office into a theater of tension, with me as the unwilling protagonist in a drama I hadn't written. Even the environment seemed hostile. The fluorescent lights too bright, the hum of the AC too loud, the constant pinging of emails and notifications a reminder that nothing was safe, nothing was private. By the end of the second month in this new reality, I was living in a state of constant hyper-awareness. Every task, every interaction, every glance carried meaning. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over an abyss, one misstep away from total collapse. And yet, the thought of leaving haunted me. Quitting would mean admitting defeat, letting my boss win, walking away from everything I had worked so hard to achieve. But staying meant enduring humiliation, stress, and the slow erosion of my mental health. I began imagining different ways to navigate the situation, careful documentation, silent resistance, strategically choosing which battles to fight. But each approach came with its own risk. Every decision felt like a gamble with stakes too high to measure. I couldn't confide in HR. I had already witnessed how loyalty and manipulation were rewarded over honesty. I couldn't confront my boss directly without risking further retaliation. And my colleagues, while sympathetic, were too entangled in the office politics to offer real support. I was utterly alone in a system designed to make me fail. One evening, after yet another meeting where I was subtly blamed for an outcome I had no control over, I found myself walking through the city streets, far from the sterile lights of the office. The night air was cold and sharp, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to unravel slightly, but the mental fog remained. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, missed family dinners, late nights, weekends spent working instead of resting. And now, here I was, caught in a web of manipulation, realizing that none of it guaranteed respect, recognition, or fairness. I knew I had reached a critical point. I could feel the lines between perseverance and self-destruction blurring. Every day I stayed, every extra hour I logged, felt like a step deeper into a trap from which escape seemed impossible. And yet, the thought of leaving brought with it a different kind of fear, the unknown, the loss of hard-earned status, the uncertainty of starting over in a world that had already shown me how ruthless it could be. It was in that moment, walking alone under the flickering streetlights, that I truly understood the complexity of my dilemma. I wasn't just facing a toxic boss. I was facing a system that rewarded manipulation, a workplace where merit meant nothing, and a personal fear of failure that had driven me to this precarious edge. I had to make a choice, but I had no map, no guide, and no certainty that either path would lead to safety or success. And so, I returned home that night, exhausted, hollow, and haunted by the realization that the promotion I had fought so hard for had not been a victory at all. It was a carefully crafted trap. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer, my hands trembling slightly as I considered my options. Leave and lose everything I had worked for, or stay and risk losing myself entirely. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, a constant reminder that in this corporate game, I was both a player and a pawn, and the rules were written by someone who had no intention of playing fair. The tension at work had become unbearable, and yet, despite all the stress and humiliation, I found myself trapped in a web I couldn't escape. Every day was a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between proving my worth and protecting myself from the inevitable blame that seemed to lurk around every corner. I had started noticing patterns in my boss's behavior that I hadn't fully understood before. Their praise was always strategic, never genuine. Any compliment came paired with a subtle jab, a reminder that no matter what I accomplished, it was never enough. They had a way of making even success feel like failure, of twisting facts until the narrative favored them entirely. One morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to get a jump on my workload and regain some sense of control. The fluorescent lights were harsh and cold, and the hum of the AC seemed louder than normal, as if amplifying the anxiety that had settled over me like a heavy fog. I opened my emails and immediately noticed the first warning sign, a message from my boss, brief and curt, requesting a meeting in their office. The subject line was vague, project review. My stomach sank. I had been diligent, preparing every report meticulously, but experience had taught me that nothing could guarantee safety when my boss had an agenda. I walked into the office with my notes in hand, my heart pounding, and tried to maintain a calm, professional demeanor. My boss was already seated, glancing at their screen, but their expression was unreadable. "Sit," they said without looking up. I obeyed, my palms slightly sweaty, gripping the notebook I had brought. For a moment, there was silence. Then, they began reviewing the project files, slowly flipping through documents, occasionally muttering comments under their breath. My mind raced, trying to anticipate what they might latch onto, what I could have possibly overlooked. And then it happened. A minor discrepancy in the project timeline, a change my boss had made without informing me, was presented as though it were my responsibility. "How did you let this slip?" they demanded, their voice sharp, cutting through the quiet. I immediately referenced my notes, my emails, my documented approvals. I explained clearly, detailing the chain of events and highlighting that the adjustment had originated from them. My boss listened, eyes narrowing, then leaned back and smiled faintly, almost mockingly. "Well, it's your job to manage these things. Make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll be keeping a closer eye on your performance." The subtle implication was clear. No matter the truth, I would be the one held accountable. After the meeting, I returned to my desk, feeling drained and violated. I began noticing that my colleagues were watching me with a mixture of sympathy and caution. Some whispered, offering quiet warnings. "Don't trust them. They'll take credit for anything and blame you for everything." Others avoided me entirely, perhaps not wanting to be implicated in my growing vulnerability. The isolation was profound. Even friendly interactions felt tainted, as if everyone in the office had been conditioned to participate in this invisible game of manipulation. Over the next few weeks, the stress intensified. My boss began assigning last-minute tasks, often contradictory, forcing me into impossible situations. Deadlines were shortened, resources were limited, and yet the expectation of flawless performance remained. Every project became a minefield, every email a potential weapon. I had to develop hypervigilance, scrutinizing every word, anticipating every possible misinterpretation. The burden was exhausting, both mentally and physically. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, drafting emails in my mind, imagining meetings that hadn't yet happened. The anxiety became a physical presence, gnawing at my stomach, constricting my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I found myself snapping at minor frustrations, my patience eroding, my usual sense of humor gone. I was constantly on edge, and yet I couldn't afford to show weakness. The office was a battlefield, and any display of vulnerability could be exploited. One particularly tense afternoon, my boss called me into their office again. They had received a complaint from a client regarding a delay in a deliverable. I knew immediately that this was another trap. I had documented every step, every approval, every communication. I presented the evidence calmly, step by step, expecting acknowledgement or at least a fair review. Instead, my boss leaned forward, eyes piercing, and said, "You need to take responsibility for this. Clients don't care about your documentation. They care about results. You're in charge. Own it." I wanted to argue, to insist that the delay was caused by their last-minute changes, but their tone allowed no room for discussion. I left the office, seething, feeling both anger and helplessness. The stress began to manifest in unexpected ways. I started experiencing severe tension headaches, jaw pain from clenching my teeth, and constant fatigue. My appetite was inconsistent. Some days I barely ate, other days I binged mindlessly, trying to fill the void left by relentless anxiety. My thoughts became obsessive. I replayed meetings endlessly, scrutinized every interaction, and questioned my own judgment. Was I missing something? Had I somehow contributed to the chaos without realizing it? The doubt was insidious, eating away at my confidence. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I began seriously contemplating quitting. The idea was terrifying, yet strangely liberating. I imagined walking away, leaving the office behind, shedding the weight of manipulation, blame, and constant vigilance. I thought about starting fresh somewhere new, in a place where merit mattered, where honesty and competence were recognized. And yet, the fear of failure, of losing the status, the salary, the recognition I had fought so hard to achieve, held me back. Leaving would feel like admitting defeat, acknowledging that my effort, my sacrifice, and my hard work had been for nothing. Then, one afternoon, a colleague pulled me aside. "I don't know how you're managing," they whispered, glancing around nervously. "They're setting you up. Everyone knows it, but nobody can prove it. You have to be careful. Their words struck me like a cold wave. The realization hit me fully. I was alone. My boss had orchestrated this entire environment so carefully that even allies were powerless, their support limited to whispered warnings. I was trapped, ensnared in a system where evidence meant little and perception ruled all. I tried to find ways to protect myself without giving up entirely. I became hypervigilant with documentation, triple-checking emails, meticulously tracking every decision and approval. I started keeping a personal log of interactions, noting times, dates, and content of meetings. I even recorded phone calls discreetly when I could, a desperate attempt to arm myself with proof should the situation escalate further. Yet, despite these precautions, the constant anxiety never abated. Every ping of a new email, every unexpected message from my boss, set my heart racing, my thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The breaking point came unexpectedly. A major client had requested a revision of a critical proposal. I coordinated with the team, delegated tasks, and ensured everything was on schedule. Hours before the deadline, my boss made significant adjustments to the proposal without informing me. When I submitted the final version, I was immediately summoned. "This is unacceptable," they said, pointing to the sections they had altered. "How could this happen on your watch?" I felt my stomach drop. I tried to explain, to show that the changes had originated from them, but my words were dismissed. "You're responsible. Always remember that," they added, their voice final. I left the office feeling hollow, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a physical force. After that incident, I started questioning my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Had I become too paranoid? But the evidence was undeniable. The repeated patterns, the manipulations, the blame shifting, it all pointed to a deliberate strategy. My promotion, once a source of pride, had become a tool of control, a mechanism to entrap me. I felt a growing sense of anger, mingled with fear. My boss wasn't just exploiting me. They were shaping the environment to ensure I remained under their thumb indefinitely. I began considering drastic options. Could I confront them directly? Could I report them to HR? The thought terrified me. HR seemed complicit in maintaining the status quo, rewarding loyalty to management rather than fairness. And confronting my boss risked escalation, retaliation, or complete professional ruin. Every path seemed fraught with danger, every decision a potential disaster. Yet, amidst the despair, a small spark of resolve emerged. I realized that I couldn't continue living in a constant state of fear and humiliation. I had to make a choice: endure the manipulation indefinitely, sacrificing my mental and emotional well-being, or take control of my destiny, even if it meant risking everything. The moral and professional stakes were immense, and the path forward was anything but clear. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't continue as a pawn in someone else's game. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights outside my window, feeling the weight of exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty pressing down on me. I reflected on the countless hours I had sacrificed, the missed opportunities, the mental anguish. I realized that the promotion I had once celebrated had become a symbol of everything I had endured and everything I still had to confront. The decision loomed like a dark cloud over me: stay and fight, navigating the treacherous landscape of corporate politics, or leave and reclaim my autonomy, accepting the unknown consequences of starting over. The choice was mine, but it was terrifying in its magnitude. The morning of the day I finally made my decision felt surreal. I woke up earlier than usual, the city outside my window still cloaked in the pale light of dawn, the streets quiet and almost eerily calm. For the first time in months, I felt a strange clarity amidst the constant haze of anxiety and doubt. I had spent countless sleepless nights weighing my options, replaying interactions, imagining worst-case scenarios, and now, at this fragile juncture, I realized that clarity had arrived in the form of necessity. I couldn't continue living in a constant state of fear, blame, and manipulation. As I prepared for work, every movement felt deliberate. The shower was lukewarm, the scent of soap and shampoo grounding me in the present. I dressed carefully, choosing a suit I had meticulously maintained for important meetings. I wanted to appear composed, authoritative, capable, attributes I had fought so hard to embody, even as they had been weaponized against me. My bag was packed with everything I might need: notes, evidence of my work, and the mental rehearsal of conversations I intended to have. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, however tenuous, over my own narrative. The commute to the office was long, and I spent it in quiet reflection. I thought about all the months I had endured, the late nights, the missed family events, the anxiety, the headaches, the constant internal calculations. I remembered the small moments of triumph, the successful projects, the moments when I had helped colleagues solve problems, the rare instances when my work had been acknowledged, if only fleetingly. And yet, all of these achievements were overshadowed by the relentless manipulation I had faced. The promotion I had once celebrated had become a symbol of my entrapment. I had been elevated only to be ensnared, and I refused to let that define the rest of my professional life. The office felt tense, as if it sensed the storm that had been building for months. My boss was at their desk, reviewing documents with a meticulous intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I approached calmly, placing my notes on the desk and exhaling slowly. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. They looked up, eyebrows raised, curiosity flickering across their face, though I knew it was a carefully controlled expression. "About what?" they asked, the casualness in their tone betraying none of the tension I felt simmering beneath the surface. I sat down, placing my hands on the desk and meeting their gaze directly. "About the way things have been going," I began, carefully choosing my words. "About the projects, the communication, and the way responsibilities have been handled." My boss tilted their head, listening but not interrupting, their eyes narrowing slightly, calculating. I could feel the subtle shift in power dynamics, the quiet tension in the air, as if the office itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. "I've reviewed every project meticulously," I continued, presenting my evidence: emails, timelines, approval chains, and meeting notes. "I've documented every step, every change, every instruction. The delays, the errors, and the miscommunications were not my responsibility. They originated elsewhere, and I have the documentation to prove it." I laid the papers out, one by one, my hands steady, my voice unwavering. I could see the faint twitch of recognition, or perhaps irritation, cross my boss's face. They had never been confronted with facts in such a direct, irrefutable way. For a moment, there was silence. The hum of the office seemed louder, the ticking of the wall clock pronounced, the faint scent of coffee and paper filling the space. Then, slowly, deliberately, my boss leaned back in their chair, steepling their fingers. "So, you're saying none of this is your fault?" they asked, their tone neutral but carrying an undertone of challenge. I nodded. "Exactly. I've done everything within my power to manage these responsibilities, and yet I've been held accountable for circumstances beyond my control." They studied me for a long moment, and I could feel the subtle shift in the room. There was no immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology, no validation. Just a silent assessment, a weighing of power, a test to see if I would falter under pressure. I felt my own pulse quicken, but I remained resolute. I had rehearsed this confrontation countless times, and now, standing at the edge of months of frustration and emotional turmoil, I refused to back down. "Then perhaps," my boss said finally, their voice measured, "it's time to reconsider how you approach your role." The ambiguity of their words struck me, and for a moment, I considered the possibility of compromise. But the months of manipulation, the constant undermining, the isolation, and the relentless stress left no room for negotiation. I had reached the point where endurance alone was no longer sufficient. Action was required. "I've considered that," I replied calmly, "and I've realized that continuing under these conditions is no longer sustainable. I am resigning from my position, effective immediately." The words felt like a release, a declaration of autonomy that had been denied to me for far too long. My boss's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps irritation, crossing their face. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. I was no longer a pawn. I was a decision-maker in my own right. There was a brief silence, and then my boss leaned forward, voice lower, almost a whisper. "Are you sure about this? You've worked hard for this position. Walking away could have consequences." I met their gaze, steady and unwavering. I've considered it thoroughly. The consequences of staying, of continuing to be manipulated, blamed, and undermined, are far worse. I cannot sacrifice my well-being for a system that does not value fairness or integrity. I packed my belongings deliberately, each item a symbol of the months of effort, frustration, and resilience. As I placed my notes and personal items into my bag, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The office, once a source of anxiety and dread, now felt strangely empty, as if it had been holding its breath in anticipation of my decision. Colleagues passed by, some casting curious glances, others offering quiet nods of acknowledgement. I realized then that my departure would ripple through the office, perhaps shaking the carefully constructed hierarchy my boss had maintained. Before leaving, I took one last look at my workspace. The neatly stacked papers, the glowing screen, the familiar chair and desk, all symbols of months of struggle, endurance, and manipulation. I felt a profound sense of closure, a recognition of what I had endured and what I had survived. Walking out of the office, I exhaled deeply, the tension in my shoulders loosening slightly. The corridors, the fluorescent lights, the hum of activity, all faded behind me as I stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The sense of freedom was intoxicating, but also tempered by uncertainty. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown, relinquishing the security of salary, status, and familiarity. Yet it also meant reclaiming my autonomy, my peace of mind, and my dignity. I had endured months of being a scapegoat, of being undermined and manipulated, and I had survived. Now, I had the chance to rebuild on my own terms, free from the invisible chains that had bound me for so long. In the following days, I reflected on the experience with a mixture of anger, relief, and clarity. I realized that the corporate environment I had once idealized was capable of profound cruelty, often disguised as ambition or competition. I understood that promotions and titles were not always indicators of merit or success, but could be tools of control, manipulation, and exploitation. Most importantly, I learned that self-respect, mental health, and personal integrity were worth more than any title or paycheck. I took the lessons with me as I began the process of searching for a new position, one where competence was valued, where honesty and collaboration were respected, and where I could apply the skills and experience I had honed over years of dedication. Each interview, each interaction, was a reminder of my resilience, of the strength I had discovered in facing months of undue blame and manipulation. Looking back, I realized that the promotion I had fought so hard for was never a reward. It was a test. And through that test, I discovered something more important than status or recognition. I discovered my own boundaries, my capacity to endure, and my courage to reclaim control over my life. Leaving was not a failure. It was the ultimate assertion of agency, a refusal to be a pawn in someone else's game. The experience left scars, emotional, mental, and even physical, but it also left me wiser, stronger, and more attuned to the subtle dynamics of power, manipulation, and human behavior. I learned to trust my instincts, to recognize toxic patterns, and to assert my worth, no matter the opposition. And most importantly, I learned that sometimes the bravest and most strategic decision is not to fight endlessly within a broken system, but to step away, reclaim your autonomy, and rebuild on your own terms. As I walked away from the building for the final time, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a golden light across the city streets. The weight that had pressed on my chest for months lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that whatever it was, I would face it on my own terms, armed with the knowledge, resilience, and self-respect that had been forged in the crucible of a corporate battlefield. And for the first time in months, I felt truly free.